The wind still whispers across the abandoned plantation fields, carrying echoes of pain that never faded. Beneath the cracked soil lie not just unmarked graves, but a buried truth the powerful worked for more than a century to erase. In dusty ledgers, faded ink, and blood-stained records, a forbidden bloodline was carefully hidden, one that tied an enslaved woman to the very family that claimed ownership over her life. For generations, this secret sat locked inside brittle plantation books, masked behind cold calculations of profit and punishment. But records have a way of surviving longer than lies. When historians finally opened those pages, they uncovered a story so disturbing that it shook the foundation of what we were taught about slavery, power, and silence. This is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a story of survival, betrayal, and a system that treated human beings as property, while secretly mingling their blood with their captors. What you are about to hear is uncomfortable, haunting, and necessary. If stories like this matter to you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a hidden history like this. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. History connects us across borders. Now take a deep breath, because this story runs darker than you expect. The plantation system in the American South was not merely an agricultural enterprise, but a carefully engineered structure of domination that fused economy, law, religion, and violence into a single machine of control. Wealth was extracted from human suffering, and that suffering was normalized through generations of conditioning that taught white landowners to see themselves as benevolent rulers rather than brutal exploiters. Every aspect of plantation life was designed to strip enslaved people of identity, agency, and history, while elevating the master's authority to something almost sacred and untouchable. At its foundation, the system depended on dehumanization. Enslaved men, women, and children were recorded in ledgers like livestock, valued only for their labor potential and reproductive capacity. Their names were often replaced with numbers, their families broken apart at auction blocks, and their humanity erased in legal documents that labeled them property rather than people. This bureaucratic cruelty made it easier for plantation elites to justify unimaginable brutality while maintaining a veneer of civilization. Power on the plantation operated through constant surveillance and fear. Overseers enforced discipline with whips, chains, and public punishment meant not just to inflict pain, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. Violence was not random but systematic, a language of dominance that reminded every enslaved person that resistance could cost them their life. Meanwhile, the master remained physically distant yet psychologically omnipresent, ruling through a network of coercion that extended from field to household. Economic greed shaped every relationship within this hierarchy. Cotton, sugar, and tobacco profits depended on exhausting labor, so planters created conditions where survival itself was conditional on obedience. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk, yet received nothing in return except minimal rations and shelter that barely met basic human needs. The wealth built on their backs funded lavish lifestyles, political power, and social prestige for white families who refused to acknowledge the blood-soaked foundation beneath their prosperity. Social control went hand in hand with cultural erasure. Enslaved Africans were forbidden from practicing many of their traditions, languages, and spiritual beliefs. Plantation owners sought to remake them into submissive laborers molded to serve white society. Even their family bonds were treated as temporary privileges rather than inherent rights, allowing masters to sell relatives away whenever it suited their financial interests. Legal systems reinforced this imbalance with chilling precision. Courts treated enslaved people as incapable of testimony, granting near-total impunity to white abusers. Laws criminalized education, movement, and assembly among the enslaved, ensuring that ignorance and isolation kept rebellion at bay. This legal architecture did more than protect slavery, it sanctified it as a legitimate social order. Within this framework, hidden bloodlines became an open secret embedded in the very structure of power. Many masters fathered children with enslaved women through coercion or outright assault, yet the system allowed them to deny these relationships while still benefiting from them. These children existed in a liminal space, tied by blood to their oppressors but condemned by law to the same bondage as their mothers. The hidden relationship behind the bloodline was not a romance, a misunderstanding, or a forbidden love, but a reality forged in domination where power erased consent before it could even exist. On many plantations, Intimacy between masters and enslaved women was less a private affair and more a structural feature of slavery itself, woven into its daily rhythms. The plantation household blurred boundaries in ways that always favored the master, who controlled food, shelter, punishment, and survival. Behind closed doors, the line between authority and violation disappeared entirely, leaving enslaved women trapped in a space where resistance meant torture and silence meant survival. These relationships rarely began with a single event, but with a slow, predatory process. Masters observed, selected, and claimed women they desired, often starting when they were still young. Some were placed inside the big house as domestic workers, where proximity made exploitation easier and more concealed. In kitchens, bedrooms, and storage rooms, power operated quietly but mercilessly, while the rest of the plantation pretended ignorance even when whispers circulated among the enslaved community. The imbalance was absolute. An enslaved woman could not refuse, negotiate, or appeal to any authority because every authority stood on the master's side. Her body was legally considered his property, meaning any act imposed upon her was framed not as violence but as the owner exercising his rights. This legal fiction allowed brutality to masquerade as normal domestic order, and it ensured that these hidden relationships were protected rather than punished. Secrecy surrounded these encounters, yet they were paradoxically known by everyone. Enslaved people spoke in hushed tones about certain women being favored, singled out, or removed from field labor without explanation. At the same time, white society maintained a collective silence that functioned like a shield, refusing to acknowledge what was plainly visible. Reputation mattered only for the master, never for the woman whose life was being reshaped without her consent. Coercion took many forms beyond physical force. Some masters offered extra rations, lighter work, or protection from overseers as tools of manipulation. Others threatened punishment against family members to guarantee compliance. What appeared on the surface as favoritism was often just another layer of control, binding the woman emotionally and materially to her abuser while isolating her from her own community. Children born from these encounters embodied the plantation's deepest hypocrisy. Their existence proved the relationship, yet the system worked tirelessly to erase that proof. Birth records were altered, surnames denied, and legal definitions twisted so that blood connection never translated into freedom or recognition. The child belonged to the same master who fathered them, making the betrayal both personal and institutional. Within this environment, the hidden relationship became less about two individuals and more about how power reproduced itself through silence, denial, and exploitation in ways that lingered in faded ledgers, half-burned letters, and memories carried across generations. The plantation records were never meant to be a confession, yet they carried one anyway, buried beneath columns of numbers, dates, and cold calculations of human value. Thick, leather-bound ledgers listed enslaved people alongside livestock, tools, and crops, reducing lives to inventory. But in the margins, faint pencil marks, erased names, and overwritten dates revealed disturbances in this rigid order. Historians who later handled these fragile pages felt as though they were touching a crime scene that had waited more than a century to be uncovered, its silence cracking with every turned page. Birth registries told the most haunting part of the story. Several children were recorded without fathers, yet unusually marked as household property rather than field laborers. Their placement inside the main house contradicted their legal status, suggesting an unspoken connection that no document dared to openly acknowledge. In some entries, original surnames were scratched out and replaced with generic labels, as if the truth had been written first and then deliberately erased in haste. Tax records added another chilling layer. Certain enslaved women were appraised at far higher values than others with similar ages and skills. Their worth rose dramatically in specific years, coinciding with their presence inside the master's residence. These financial shifts hinted that their bodies carried both labor value and something far more disturbing that the ledger could never explicitly state. Plantation account books exposed patterns that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. Gifts of fabric, medicine, or special rations were repeatedly allocated to the same woman over decades. While others struggled for basic survival, she received privileges that appeared benevolent on paper but masked a deeper relationship of control. These transactions formed a quiet trail that pointed toward favoritism rooted in exploitation. Letters between family members, preserved alongside official records, deepened the darkness. Though coded in polite language, they referenced matters that were never fully explained. Phrases about protecting the family name or handling delicate situations suggested anxiety about what might be revealed. Paper stains, torn corners, and missing pages indicated that someone had tried to sanitize history before it could be examined. Manumission documents, rare and carefully worded, raised even more questions. In a few cases, children were freed years later without clear justification, yet no acknowledgement of paternal ties appeared. The timing aligned suspiciously with inheritance disputes, implying that freedom was granted not out of morality but legal convenience to avoid scandal. Taken together, these scattered records formed a mosaic of hidden truth that could not be ignored. Every ledger, receipt, and registry piece revealed how bureaucracy had been weaponized to conceal intimacy, erase lineage, and maintain a facade of respectable power while preserving a brutal reality beneath the surface. Her life began in bondage before she could even recognize her own reflection. Born into a world where breath itself belonged to someone else. From infancy, she was carried on the backs of older enslaved women while her mother labored under the sun, her cries blending with the rhythm of field songs that were equal parts prayer and mourning. There were no birthdays, no tender lullabies, only the harsh reality that survival depended on obedience. As she grew, the plantation claimed her body long before childhood could claim her spirit, shaping her into labor rather than allowing her to become a person. By the time she could walk steadily, she was already put to work, fetching water, cleaning tools, and running errands for overseers who never saw her as a child. Dirt clung to her bare feet, and scars from minor punishments marked her skin as early reminders of where she stood in the hierarchy. Other children played when they could, but their laughter was fragile, always interrupted by commands, threats, or the crack of a whip echoing across the fields. Every day taught her that innocence was a luxury enslaved children were never permitted to keep. As she entered adolescence, her duties shifted inside the plantation house, a place that looked like comfort, but concealed deeper terror. She scrubbed floors until her hands bled, washed linens that hid unspeakable secrets, and moved silently through rooms where power watched her every step. The walls were filled with portraits of the master's family smiling in prosperity built on her suffering. She learned quickly that invisibility was safer than being noticed, yet attention came whether she wanted it or not. Her body became another tool of the plantation, inspected, controlled, and exploited without her consent. Nights were the most frightening, when footsteps echoed through dark corridors and she could not escape what waited behind closed doors. During the day, she carried herself with forced composure, though exhaustion hollowed her eyes and tightened her bones. Other enslaved women whispered warnings, but their words offered no protection, only shared dread. In the fields, she witnessed relentless brutality that scarred her mind as deeply as any physical wound. Men collapsed from heat and were dragged away like broken equipment. Women were punished publicly to instill fear, and families were torn apart without warning. She understood that compassion had no place on the plantation, where profit mattered more than human life. Each scene hardened her, not out of cruelty, but out of the necessity to endure. Yet within this darkness, she clung to fragments of humanity that slavery could not fully extinguish. She shared stolen moments of solidarity with other women, passing down whispered stories, healing remedies, and quiet songs sung only after sunset. These small acts of connection kept her spirit from disappearing completely, even as her body remained trapped. Still, every act of resistance, no matter how subtle, carried the risk of brutal retaliation. Years passed in a cycle of labor, fear, and silent endurance that wore her down but never entirely erased her. The plantation aged around her, records piled higher, and children came and went, yet her suffering remained constant. She moved through each day knowing that her existence was written not as a life but as property in someone else's ledger. The master's family lived behind polished doors and manicured gardens that hid a moral rot beneath their refinement. To outsiders, they appeared charitable, disciplined, and God-fearing, yet their wealth was inseparable from the suffering occurring just beyond their veranda. Dinner tables glittered with silver while screams drifted in from the fields, but no one paused their conversation. Silence was not accidental in this household. It was cultivated like a tradition passed from parent to child. The mistress maintained an image of gentility while carefully avoiding what she clearly knew. She instructed servants, arranged social gatherings, and spoke of morality in church, all while turning a blind eye to the treatment of enslaved women inside her own home. Her authority rested on pretending ignorance, yet every chore, every reassignment, and every whispered rumor traveled through her hands. By refusing to confront the truth, she became just as complicit as her husband. Children of the master grew up learning unspoken rules rather than formal lessons about power. They saw enslaved people as part of the household landscape, present but not human, useful but not worthy of empathy. When questions arose about certain women or children who resembled their father, they were quickly silenced. Curiosity was smothered with warnings about reputation, inheritance, and the importance of keeping the family name untarnished. The master himself wore silence like a second skin, treating his authority as unquestionable and his actions beyond moral scrutiny. In public, he spoke proudly of discipline, order, and Christian duty, yet behind closed doors he exercised control without remorse. He relied on secrecy not out of shame, but out of entitlement, believing his status granted him immunity from accountability or consequence. Extended relatives who visited the plantation participated in the same collective denial. Aunts, uncles, and cousins commented on the efficiency of the estate while deliberately ignoring the darker realities that sustained it. Some suspected the truth, others knew it outright, but none challenged the patriarch. Their comfort depended on preserving a shared illusion that kept their privilege intact. When uncomfortable incidents threatened to surface, the family responded not with honesty, but with calculated erasure. Records were altered, stories reshaped, and certain enslaved individuals quietly relocated to other properties. The goal was never justice or reconciliation, only preservation of a spotless public image that could withstand gossip, scrutiny, and historical memory. Over generations, this silence hardened into legacy. Descendants inherited both the wealth built on exploitation and the refusal to acknowledge its origins. Portraits hung proudly in parlors, land titles passed smoothly through wills, and the hidden bloodline remained buried beneath layers of polite denial that stretched across more than a century. The child born from this bloodline entered the world wrapped in contradiction, belonging to two lineages while being fully accepted by neither. From the moment of birth, their skin marked them as different, lighter than most enslaved children, yet darker than the master's household. Midwives whispered quietly in the quarters, recognizing the resemblance in the shape of the eyes, the curl of the hair, the line of the jaw that mirrored the plantation owner. Still, on paper, the infant was recorded simply as property, a number in a ledger rather than a name in a family tree. As the child grew, their daily life reflected this uneasy limbo. They were spared the harshest field labor, but were never allowed to sit at the master's table or claim kinship with his children. Instead, they moved between spaces, sometimes running errands inside the big house, sometimes sent back to the quarters as a reminder of where they legally belonged. Other enslaved children viewed them with a mix of pity, resentment, and caution, unsure whether to see them as privileged or cursed. Inside the plantation house, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. Visitors occasionally remarked on how familiar the child looked, comments that caused instant tension and forced smiles. Servants were quick to redirect conversations while the mistress grew increasingly distant, treating the child with cold politeness rather than maternal warmth. The master, when present, maintained a detached authority that revealed nothing yet spoke volumes through his silence. The emotional burden of this bloodline weighed heavily as the child matured. They sensed they were connected to power that would never claim them, and to a mother whose suffering was inseparable from their existence. At night, they listened to stories in the quarters about families torn apart, knowing their own family was fractured in a far more complicated way. Their identity became a battlefield between survival, loyalty, and an aching desire to be recognized as human. Legal status deepened the cruelty of their position. By law, they remained enslaved, inheriting bondage through their mother, despite sharing blood with the man who owned them. In some cases, records were manipulated to keep their origins ambiguous, listing no father at all. This deliberate erasure ensured that even biological connection could not translate into freedom, protection, or inheritance. As years passed, the child watched other enslaved people sold, punished, or worked to exhaustion while they remained inside the household. This relative proximity to comfort did not feel like mercy, but like a constant reminder of what was being denied. Every polished floor they walked across, every meal they served, reinforced the cruel paradox that they were both insider and outsider at the same time. Eventually, their presence became a living secret the plantation could never fully hide. Neighbors suspected, relatives whispered, and the enslaved community remembered, even when documents tried to forget. The child grew into adulthood carrying a legacy of silence, survival, and unresolved belonging that stretched far beyond their own lifetime. Decades after the plantation fell into ruin, historians arrived not as conquerors but as quiet investigators walking through layers of buried memory. The land looked peaceful at first glance, overgrown with vines and cracked by time, yet every step felt heavy with what had happened there. They came armed with notebooks, cameras, and patience, knowing that the truth rarely reveals itself easily. Local communities spoke in fragments, passing down stories that official archives had long ignored, and those whispers guided scholars toward forgotten records stored in dusty basements and neglected courthouses. In dimly lit archives, researchers sifted through brittle papers that crumbled at the touch. Many documents were poorly preserved, some intentionally damaged, yet patterns began to emerge through careful comparison. Historians cross-referenced tax books, birth registries, letters, and estate inventories, slowly reconstructing a narrative that powerful families had tried to erase. Each discovery felt less like finding information and more like reviving a voice that had been silenced for generations. Oral histories proved just as important as written records. Elder descendants of the enslaved community recounted stories passed down from grandparents who had lived under the plantation's shadow. These memories did not always match official documents, but their emotional truth carried undeniable weight. Scholars realized that history existed not only in ink, but in lived experience, pain, and remembrance carried through time. Forensic examination of records revealed inconsistencies that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Missing pages, altered names, and unexplained changes in status pointed toward deliberate manipulation. Historians began mapping family trees that stretched across racial lines, uncovering connections that plantation elites had worked tirelessly to obscure. The more they dug, the clearer the hidden bloodline became. Some descendants of the master's family resisted these findings, arguing that scholars were misinterpreting evidence or sensationalizing the past. Others, confronted with undeniable proof, struggled with guilt, denial, or reluctant acceptance. Meanwhile, researchers remained focused not on blame, but on reconstruction of truth, determined to honor those whose lives had been reduced to property. As findings were published, the broader public began to confront a history that was far more complex and brutal than romanticized plantation myths. Museums, universities, and historical societies opened conversations about slavery's intimate violence and its lingering impact. What had once been buried in ledgers now reshaped how people understood race, power, and lineage in America. Through painstaking work, historians transformed scattered fragments into a coherent account that restored dignity to those erased from official memory. The plantation records, once tools of oppression, became evidence of resilience, exposing how truth can survive even when those in power try to destroy it. The legacy of this hidden bloodline stretches far beyond the boundaries of a single plantation, echoing through generations that followed in its shadow. The wealth built on coerced labor and concealed intimacy did not vanish with emancipation, but continued to shape access to land, education, and opportunity. Descendants of the master's family inherited property, social standing, and influence, while descendants of the enslaved inherited poverty, displacement, and fractured family histories. This imbalance was not accidental, but a direct continuation of the structures that slavery created, leaving scars that time alone could not heal. Across the South, similar stories lay buried in other ledgers, reminding people that this was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger pattern of power and exploitation. Plantations may have crumbled, yet their social hierarchies lingered in laws, institutions, and cultural attitudes that persisted well into the modern era. Segregation, discrimination, and economic inequality were not new inventions, but extensions of the same mindset that once justified bondage. The hidden bloodline became a symbol of how deeply intertwined oppression and privilege had been. For descendants of the enslaved woman, uncovering the truth brought both pain and clarity. Many had grown up with fragmented stories, family mysteries, or unexplained physical resemblances that never fully made sense. Learning about their ancestry forced them to confront centuries of trauma, but it also restored a sense of identity that had been deliberately erased. Their lineage was no longer defined solely by suffering, but by resilience, survival, and endurance in the face of relentless injustice. Public reckoning with this history challenged romanticized narratives of plantation life that had long dominated books, films, and tourism. Museums began to center enslaved voices rather than glorifying grand mansions and manicured gardens. School curricula slowly shifted to include the intimate violence of slavery rather than treating it as a distant economic system. The hidden bloodline story helped people understand that history was not just about wars and politics, but about real lives shaped by power. At the same time, descendants of the master's family were forced to examine their own inheritance in a new light. Some chose denial, clinging to myths of honor and tradition, while others sought reconciliation and acknowledgement. A few engaged in difficult conversations with black descendants, recognizing that their family's prosperity had been built on exploitation. These dialogues, though often painful, opened pathways toward truth that previous generations had refused to walk.